at our global automotive team. So all of our leaders from automotive around the world have been talking about what's going on in auto, where are things going next, and it's been an absolutely fascinating and intriguing conversation. And just if we could, the Capgemini people from our auto practice, if you could quickly just raise your hand. So as you see, there's a few of us around. So again, after the event, if you want to kind of get some prerogative in our thinking around auto, we encourage you to do so. But it's absolutely staggering and fascinating to see what's going on in the world of mobility and transportation, and we're really intrigued and excited tonight to have Sunil joining us. And one question that I have for Sunil, and he does not have to answer this, but I'm thinking if you're a pioneer in the autonomous space, in the ride-sharing space, like just how did you arrive here tonight? Was it like by drone? Was it like some kind of amazing new technology? So maybe he'll shed a little light on that. But let me hand it over to our partner and my friend Pete Layden, who's helped us so much with this conference series, and he'll guide us for the rest of the night. Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Capgemini. And this is, like you said, this is the series that keeps growing. In fact, we're going to be going to New York, actually, in the fall. For those, there's a lot of folks here who haven't been here. And so it's worth just touching base on what makes this a little different. One of the things is there's no way one person can fully understand and get a handle on all the innovation just exploding throughout the San Francisco Bay Area region right now. And so what we've done with this series is each month we go to a different field that's having this kind of explosion of innovation, and we basically focus on it. And systematically kind of move through them all over the course of the year, and now it's our year 2 in this thing. And so tonight, we're going to autonomous vehicles. And autonomous vehicles, hot topic, a confusing topic, one that's a ton of energy, but a ton of kind of confusion on where is this going to go, what's really real, what's happening. So that's the field. The second thing we do is we always try to focus on one remarkable, well, usually one remarkable innovator, for want of a better word, a thought leader in that space who can tell us what's really going on now and where is that field going. And in this case, we've got Sunil Paul. And Sunil, in this space, in 2011, was one of the co-founders of Sidecar, and they really helped really invent the ride-sharing model, the ride-sharing space. And in fact, through their tenure there, expanded nationally, and just last year sold the last of their assets off and kind of ended their run by selling it off to GM. Now the beauty of this, in a way, is he's not a CEO. He was, by the way, the CEO through that whole period. He's not the CEO of a company, and honestly, that's great, because it's a feature, not a bug, as they say in technology, because we've got an independent mind who can say whatever he wants to say. He has no agenda to drive and no kind of predilection on really where this field's going. He's just going to give you his hit on what he has learned in his time and what he's been learning in the last year since leaving that space. The other thing about Sunil, though, is he's a serial entrepreneur. He's done other things. He was the co-founder of Brightmail, among others. Brightmail is a kind of an email filtering company. And I understand, though, he has promised his wife he will not start another company for 1 year and to give himself a space, so we'll see how that goes. But, so anyhow, serial entrepreneur, remarkable person. Third thing about this is it's what's happening now, like what's now in San Francisco. And so we really don't want people to do canned speeches or what they've been doing on the circuit. We want them to talk about what they're grappling with now, what's their new idea, what are the questions that really stymieing them, how are they wrestling with it. And for that, we've got it fresh off right off his brain here, because he was working all weekend on this thing, and he only sent us the deck that he wants to run through quickly a couple hours ago. So you are getting about as raw kind of a studio as you can get here. The other thing, though, we do want to do is we want to think forward. And we want to think, where's this is going? And one of the beauties of Sunil is he's not just an entrepreneur, a tech guy. He actually did a stint as a policy analyst at the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment, basically. And so he has actually spent a lot of time thinking about policy, and in this space also thinking about policy and looking ahead on what we can actually think about that. And the final thing I'll say about what's now is it's really you folks. The beauty of this is it's an invite-only gathering. Everyone here brings something interesting to the table. And half of this event is going to be interacting with you, hearing from your thoughts, and interacting with Sunil. You're on video as much as up on the front here, so watch out for those video cameras roaming around here. So with that, I'm going to introduce and bring up Sunil Paul for a little intro here. Come on, Sunil. Let's hear Sunil.
Hey, thanks. That was a very, very kind intro. Well, I got to say, first of all, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Capgemini, for hosting here. I've been to several of these events, and they have all been really excellent. So thank you, guys, for putting this together. I need my pointer. And I need to hit my spot, because we're live streaming. In fact, if you want to say something about that and tweet out the thingy or whatever, the URL, I hear it's called, try that, because then, people can watch it at the leisure of their own time. So, 2009 was the first time I got to ride an autonomous vehicle at Stanford in their autonomous vehicle program. But in preparation for this talk, I thought, why am I so fascinated by transportation? And I realized that when I was 4 years old, I came to the United States. It was 1968. Yeah, I'm kind of old. 1968, snowing outside Oklahoma City. Me and my mom, my sister are traveling to my father's house. And the thing that I'm told, the big observation I had about the United States was, wow, so many cars, so many cars. Only a couple of days earlier, I had been in a town, a border town in India, where the transportation was walking and, maybe occasionally a horse buggy. So in that short couple of days, I had experienced a dislocation in transportation that's comparable to what happened in the United States over the course of about 50 years. And so I think that was the beginning of my fascination with transportation. And right now, what's going on with autonomous vehicles is a comparable kind of total change in transportation. And it will fundamentally change all kinds of things that we do in society. The world we have today is built around the car, and our future world is going to be built around the autonomous car. So we'll talk about some of those things tonight. This is some of the things that I want to talk about tonight. It's one of the most beautiful charts I've ever created. I worked all weekend on this, so I hope you'll appreciate it. We're going to talk about why the pace of innovation is going to be faster than, I think, conventional wisdom, why the AV companies are actually in great danger of running into a terrible business, why car sales are going to plummet, and why AV sales are going to boom, and what the distinction is. And then we're going to touch on how cities and suburbs are going to change a lot. We're going to introduce two new ideas. One is something that I'm calling how cities will densify, something I'm calling PART. We'll explain more about that later. It's a new model for deploying autonomous vehicles. And the growth of extreme suburbs that I'm calling the Ultra Burbs. And we'll talk more about that as well. There is so much more. Like this area, there's just so many more other opportunities to talk about things. Peter talked about my background and understanding of regulation. At Sidecar, we obviously dealt with a lot of regulation. There's a significant issue there. Climate change is something I care a lot about, but we don't have time to get into all the details. Maybe we can during the Q&A. And by the way, all this is talking really about more or less passenger-size vehicles that can become autonomous. We're not even talking about drones and vertical takeoff aircraft and seaborne autonomous vehicles. There is so much more. There is so much more going on in this world. But just this world by itself, just this passenger and some delivery is going to be a big deal. So, conventional wisdom. Here's a chart from one of the analysts out there talking about how will autonomous cars be rolled out. And, it's basically now-ish is when there'll be experiments and there'll be slow adoption. And somewhere in kind of a 2030, 2040 timeframe, there'll start to be significant consumer adoption. And then It's not until the 40s or 50s that we really get to full-scale adoption of autonomous vehicles. So there are other kind of plus and minus off this, but I'm interested, how many people in this audience think, now let's define it, that more than 50, by what year will more than 50% of Americans have at least some regular interaction, ride in an autonomous vehicle? Who says by 2050? Like at least by 2050. Okay, so what about 2040? What about 2030? It's getting pretty close. Wow, okay. Who says in 10? Oh, okay, yeah, that's good. What about never? Thank you. That was an excellent question. I want to hear more about that. What about just 10 years from now? Oh, wow. Okay, well, maybe it's because I queued it up, or maybe I don't know why, but that's interesting that there's at least, what, 20%, 25% who think in 10 years we'll get to 50%. Right on, I'm with you. So in thinking about this problem, this opportunity, I think this slide seems so obvious, but to me, the beauty of it is how obvious it is. What is the fundamental nature of an autonomous vehicle? It has no driver, and it's very safe. I also worked really hard on this one, by the way. But why does that matter? Well, the reason why conventional wisdom is wrong is because of that fundamental nature of autonomous vehicles and the fundamental nature of ride-sharing networks. It's worthwhile to pause when we think about the timeframes and realize that ride-sharing is only a little bit over 5 years old. And black car, Uber, is only about 7 years old. And so we've gotten to something like, depending on how you count it, 20 to 30% of the US population is using some form of ride-sharing. Like, that's a staggering development, and it's because of the business model. So what are the fundamentals of this new business model? Well, one is that the cost of the ride is dominated by the compensation to the driver. If we look at the overall costs, it's roughly about half. Second fundamental about costs is that the second big driver is insurance. Out of that 20 to 25% that the platform, Uber, Lyft, whoever takes of the take, at least half, and in some cases far more than half, goes to insurance. Well, when these two combine, we're going to get a dramatic reduction in the cost of ride sharing, at least a reduction by half. And combine that with the ability to put people in the same car, Lyft line, Uber pool, what we used to call shared rides, you get a dramatic reduction. And we'll get this new reality, which is autonomous cars plus ride sharing is going to result in the convenience of a car at a price that's something like today's transit prices, which are heavily, heavily subsidized. This is why we'll get such rapid adoption. Now, this is not a new insight. Morgan Stanley's been saying it for years, Adam Jonas and others. But I'm rather surprised that the conventional wisdom has not yet fully embraced it, perhaps because the conventional wisdom is still thinking about automobile adoption. They're thinking about, well, how long did it take for anti-lock brakes to get adopted, et cetera, et cetera. And it's the wrong way to think about it, because people will be they'll get rid of their cars and start using these other networks because they are so convenient and so cheap. So there is an obvious question, which is what happens as a result of this rapid adoption. And this is my conclusion. But there may be a little bit of a saving grace. So let's talk about why AV makers are kind of screwed. And while there may be some opportunity. So part one, why are they screwed? So again, let's go back to fundamentals. What is the fundamental nature of a ride-sharing network? It is combining supply and demand in order to make the whole network work. What are the characteristics of, supply and demand, right? This is the supply side. So on the supply side, what is most important is that you make sure the labor is fully utilized. In other words, you've got a driver in the car, you need to make sure that that driver is busy all the time, not down, waiting for a ride, or trying to get to the pickup point. The more productive they are, the more efficient your network is, the lower your cost can be. In this new world where the driver is no longer there, you still have a significant supply expense, but now it's all capital. You've got a huge expense to go buy these cars. They're probably going to be more expensive than traditional cars. Now you've got to figure out a way to fully utilize that capital. If you spend $1 billion on your fleet, you'd better be able to rationalize an expense or a return off of that $1 billion. And it turns it into, it's just an important fundamental. And for some, you may be like, okay, what's the big deal? Well, let's turn to fundamentals of demand. The fundamental aspect about transportation demand generally, and certainly we see it in ride sharing, is that demand is super spiky. The demand on a Friday afternoon at 2 o'clock and it's sunny and you can walk is dramatically different than Friday night at 2 in the morning and it's raining. The bars are closed, you want to get home. Suddenly demand is 10x what it was just 12 hours before. I mean, we lived and breathed this problem. And the fundamental aspect of a fleet is that a fleet cannot satisfy both. Part of the magic of ride sharing is you get this very flexible supply that will come in and out. And if you've got a fixed fleet, you either have to compromise, you have to compromise on one side or the other. Either you have to be willing to have an asset that sits around idle for most of the time, but be able to satisfy that demand at 2 in the morning, or you have to be willing to have a fleet that's more or less fully utilized, even at 2 o'clock on a Friday, but at 2 in the morning, you're going to have a lot of upset customers who simply can't get a ride. This fundamental is the same reason why we own private cars. Like, why do we own private cars? Because you're willing to pay for that asset. It sits around 95% of the time doing nothing, but you're willing to do it because you have instantaneous demand, instantaneous access. Well, okay, so the nature of this is that we look at all of the different autonomous vehicle companies. They're all trying to build out their fleets with the idea that that will be their way of competing in this new world. But it's not possible to do just with a fixed fleet. There's going to need to be another model. And perhaps there are ways to do it, but I certainly don't see it in the way that existing AV companies are thinking about it. So this is kind of problem number one. There's a second reason why AV companies are screwed. And it comes down to the industry structure. Right? And so let's take a look at, in this future world, what will demand look like, what will supply look like? Well, on the supply side, you got a lot of companies. Now, this just happens to be the list of companies that have gotten permits in California for autonomous driving. It doesn't even count, I'm sure there got to be dozens, maybe an equal list of others that either want to be on that list or not yet on it, or stealth mode, whatever, or a bunch of OEMs that aren't on this list. There's a lot of companies who want to be able to provide the supply. Meanwhile, let's look at the demand. And every once in a while, there's going to be a regional provider. So there's only 4 companies in any area, for the most part, that are really able to supply demand. And if you think Uber's big on demand, Google and Apple are easily 10x the demand. And do you guys understand what I mean by this? Google and Apple both have a map product. People are going to maps. They're trying to figure out where they're going, and those companies are already providing directions on how to get to that other location. So let's play out a scenario where an AV company tries to compete and tries to build up their own demand network. You have to concentrate your deployment. You can't say, okay, I've got 100,000 vehicles, I'm going to sprinkle them around the globe. You've got to deploy in a particular area if you want any demand because you've got to get adequate coverage for a ride. So let's say you deploy in Phoenix or Singapore or San Francisco, wherever. Where will the demand come from? Well, maybe you've got a lead. Maybe you've got a lead of, I don't think anyone thinks that they've got more than a 2-year lead. By the way, they all seem to think they've got a 2-year lead. But maybe you've got a lead, and you can get a bunch of demand just from that lead. People come to you, you're half the price of Uber and whatever the regional competitor is. But meanwhile, there's a huge amount of demand sitting behind the Uber app, the Google Maps and Apple Maps, and whatever the regional company is. And they're not going to stand still and just let you take that market. I mean, the simplest thing they could do is subsidize the labor of the normal driver and hold on to their demand. But within a few years, somebody else will have the same product. And they're going to be able to come into that same market and build their own demand network. So this is, I think, sort of the second reason why companies are going to have a major problem is every market is going to be dominated by a few big demand networks, and it's going to be, I think, impossible to kind of get out of that world. We're already seeing this effect in place. If you have not tried it, go to Uber and Apple and put in a request to go from A to B. And in cities where different networks are available, they will show you the kind of wait times for different kinds of ride sharing. This would never have happened if it were up to Uber by themselves. But Uber is willing to do this, right? Normally their API, their access to their network is only on an exclusive basis. But here they have done it because it's a huge source of demand. And the same will be true for any future autonomous vehicle company. And of course, if Google and Apple come up with their own product, let's say it's a couple of years behind whoever your favorite contender is, they can simply slot it in and get that vertical integration. So not pretty. And so I think it leads to some fundamentals about the autonomous vehicle business. It's going to be a red ocean. A red ocean, I think most people are familiar, but basically a category where there's little differentiation, huge competition for margins, and margins get shrunk to nothing. It's ugly. Imagine swimming in the ocean with a lot of sharks. You want blue ocean. You want blue ocean like a new category that doesn't quite exist yet. And I don't see a lot of that in the autonomous world. Now, maybe there's a silver lining in all this. The silver lining first is, well, if you're an auto company, you've been living in a red ocean for your entire lifetime, so maybe it's not so bad. And maybe you have an advantage because you're already used to having raised within margins. You're already used to these big capital allocations. So maybe you've got an advantage in this new world. Also, I think the nature of autonomous vehicles is going to change and expand the category of vehicles. So there'll be many more opportunities for niche products compared to what we have today because of safety requirements, because of the proliferation of tastes, because of longer commute times. I think we'll see a proliferation of types of vehicles, and that'll open up opportunities for startups. But I got to say, it's silver lining on a pretty dark cloud. So what about car sales? This has been a frequent question, item of speculation. Well, let's just talk a little bit about car sales. So here's my punchline. Car sales are going to go off a cliff. If you have access to this network, you're not going to need to buy a new car. Autonomous vehicle market size is going to explode. Not necessarily, and won't necessarily make up for the number of vehicles. So why do I think that? Well, a lot of it has to do with the experience of Sidecar. I started Sidecar in part because I saw an opportunity to reduce the number of cars on the road. I saw an opportunity to have an impact on climate change. I saw an opportunity to improve congestion on the roads. And over the course of that 5 years, what I saw was interesting. What I saw was that people were able to live in neighborhoods that were less accessible to transportation. And so they're using ride sharing more often. That's a good thing for them, and certainly there are a lot of benefits to that, but it did result in more use. I saw that we and others were creative about this new capability. We're like, wow, on-demand people delivery, how about on-demand stuff delivery? And we and others started doing on-demand delivery. And so now you've got Amazon and Uber, all kinds of companies doing on-demand delivery of various sorts. And you can only expect that to increase. So what happened here? And it's something that I promise not to go into a rehash of your college economics course, but it's something that goes back to a guy named Jevons, who was an economist back in late 1800s in England. Back then, we were concerned about coal disappearing. We're running out of coal supplies. And one of his, he started looking at this problem and realized that, sorry, important fact here, engines were getting more and more efficient. And so the idea was, wow, okay, engines are getting more efficient, that's going to save us from running out of coal. But what Jevons realized is that as engines got more efficient, they started being used more widely, and people started developing new applications for them. So he coined this thing called the Jevens Effect, Jevons paradox, and you might also know about it as the Rebound Effect, and especially in energy conservation. And really what it is pretty simple. It's when there is a situation when lowering the price results in an outsized, or improving the convenience, results in an outsized improvement, or let me say it again. Imagine the top scenario is hamburgers. You drop the price a little bit of the price of hamburger, and you get a much bigger set of demand. You drop the price by 10%, and you might get a 20% or a 30% increase in the demand for hamburgers, right? But it's not always that way. Different products are different ways. So there's a different kind of, it's known as elasticity curve. Easier way to think about it is kind of a response curve. There's a different way of thinking about it. Think about a cancer drug that will save your life, right? If you drop the price of that drug by 10%, you're not going to use it 30% more. You raise the price by 30%, you're not going to use it less. That is an inelastic curve. It is non-responsive to price. So this curve you can kind of think is how responsive is something to price. So what's my point? Transportation is very responsive to price and convenience. If you make transportation easier and cheaper, people will use more of it. That's, again, I think a fundamental thing. If people are using more of it, and we're also being creative about how we can use it, there are going to be more and more autonomous vehicles to fill that demand. So I see a tremendous increase in the amount of autonomous vehicles to fill that set of demands that I can't predict, but I know that they'll be out there. Let's turn to one of the areas where I see autonomous vehicles having a big impact on the way we live. So the way that we have organized our society, but the way that we organized cities and suburbs is, I think probably many people are familiar with this, but it is intimately tied to the car. And after World War II, we basically said we're going to build freeways, we're going to organize, have access to suburbs, and it's one of a long sequence of changes in the way that we live as a result of transportation. I live in a neighborhood that used to be called a streetcar suburb. Neighborhoods that were created, made accessible because of the streetcar. Suburbs are kind of that same phenomenon for the automobile and the highway. Well, so I've asked myself, well, what happens when you have an autonomous car? What happens to your willingness to travel? There's an important idea that was developed in the 1970s. It goes by Marchetti's law. And Marchetti was a researcher. He uncovered some interesting research by another guy, but the point is that what they found was when you look at the human willingness to commute, to travel to and from your kind of tasks of life, for the most part, whether you look at different cities in sort of the 20th century, or you look at the scope of Greek villages, people are willing to travel about 30 minutes each way. And so about an hour each day. And this became known as Marchetti's law. And it's proven to be remarkably robust. And we look around at what happens when you make it more accessible, reduce traffic in a particular corridor. People typically are willing to travel further as a result. Well, I think autonomous vehicles will break Marchetti's law for a simple reason. An autonomous vehicle, the experience will, certainly there will be a commuting experience, but increasingly you're going to be able to do other things in your car. If you want to have dinner in your car, it's not going to be today's car dinner experience of a hamburger, burrito, whatever. But you have to be able to have one hand on the wheel and the other one holding on to your snack. You'll be able to have a regular meal. Think about a meal on an airplane or a train. And if you want to watch a movie, if you want to take a nap, I mean, it will be more like traveling in first class or a private jet than it is driving a car. And the fact that more aspects of our lives will be possible inside an autonomous vehicle will change the nature of how we're willing to move around. Marchetti's law will still apply in the sense that we're not going to be willing to purely commute more than about half an hour each way, but so much more of our lives will be in this autonomous car. And it also means that people will be willing to live further away from the city centers. That, combined with telecommuting, I think will lead to the rise of what I'm calling the Ultra Burbs. The Ultra Burbs are communities that are made accessible through a combination of autonomous vehicles and telecommuting. And generally speaking, we can talk about how this is good and bad. Certainly see reasons for both directions. But this is one of the insights that I'm very interested in. Uh-oh, I'm going offline. So much for telecommuting.
Yeah, no, it is really tight. Yeah, you're good. Yeah.
This is one of the ideas that I'm very interested in, like getting feedback. When Peter talked about these are ideas that are in formation, this is one of them.
Question here. How do you define telecommuting?
Telecommuting is the ability to work through means of computers and video conferencing and joint documents, all of those capabilities. So a second, and I guess I should back up a second. Back to fundamentals. An improvement in transportation is going to make the biggest difference where transportation is the biggest hassle today. So part of the rise of the Ultra Burbs is because it's a huge hassle to travel these long distances to someplace that's 45 an hour away from where you work. The other place that today is a huge pain in the ass to live in and to transport around is a city, right? In a city, you have to worry about parking, you have to worry about navigation, it's more complex. it is a difficult environment to navigate with a car. And so the rise of autonomous vehicles will make cities far more livable. We've already experienced that with ride sharing, and we see neighborhoods that are much more livable as a result of ride sharing. I think the same thing will be true of autonomous vehicles. So far, the way that people have been thinking about autonomous vehicles are as simply automating the vehicle. Like, what can you do? There's another kind of concept that's also been developed for long-distance travel called platooning. Platooning is simply the idea of allowing vehicles to follow very closely to one another. The advantage when you're on a freeway is it reduces the drag. I think you get about 10% fuel savings, and there are companies out there developing that. Daimler demonstrated this, et cetera. What if we could use platooning in a city, take small vehicles that navigate the smaller streets, join up in main thoroughfares, platoon along the major thoroughfare, and then break up as appropriate when they approach their near destination. So I'm calling this idea PART, as in BART. Right? Platooning Autonomous Rapid Transit. Now, I have to tell you, I struggled with the name of this. Like, this is how hard I work, people. I struggled with a name because I thought about maybe this doesn't sound like very much fun. So I thought maybe it should be called Party. You know, like maybe it's like it's spelled this way, but if you're in the know, you know to pronounce it Party. And then I thought, well, maybe it should be PRTI, but then I couldn't figure out what the I should stand for. Individual. Anyway, it's PART. So. So what's interesting about this is it could leverage a lot of the same infrastructure that's currently envisioned for bus rapid transit. We already have systems in San Francisco and elsewhere where the public access to bus stops is accessible to private parties, and they pay a fee for that access. You can imagine a similar system. There are all kinds of details that have to be worked out about how platooning starts and ends. But I think all that can be figured out and take advantage of the fact that on certain quarters you really want high density. At the same time, you want the convenience of being able to go door to door without having to transfer and change. So this basically would combine the convenience of door-to-door transportation with the high density of transit. So the consequence of this and other innovations, I think, will result in much, much denser cities, and we'll have these Ultra Burbs. Honestly, I'm still unclear about what's going to happen to the suburbs. It's possible that we'll have a stranded asset of transportation in the suburbs, that we'll have, you know, that will be a kind of the new neighborhoods that unfortunately fall into decline because they are stuck with this old model of transportation of the conventional car and all the infrastructure that's built around that. More to be discussed on that topic. So, some takeaways. First of all, AV adoption is happening much faster than I think most people, except for the very smart 25% that are here. I think it's coming faster than most people expect. I think that it's going to be a bloodbath for autonomous vehicle makers. That we're going to change the way that we live in cities. We're going to see the rise of Ultra Burbs and the rise of dense cities. And, I mean, I think a fundamental thing that is implicit in all this is a massive revolution, and it's only just beginning. And then there's so much more to talk about. Like, there is, Peter and I talked about this talk, there's so much on the cutting room floor of other things to talk about. There's a Q&A session, but things that I care deeply about, like climate and others. And by the way, this is the version that you can just tweet. Maybe this is a better summary. So with that, thank you very much.
The presentation is always a good little way to whet your appetite here. And what I'm going to do here is ask him just a couple follow-up questions, but also be thinking what you'd want to be talking here. Oh, his tea. Sunil is nursing a voice here that the tea is going to help. Well, here's what I would say. I just want you to do a quickie here as we get teed up here, because we had teased a little bit about what you were going to talk about here. It's 3 questions that you actually could infer from this conversation, but you couldn't really say exactly. Will autonomous vehicles make cities safer or less safe? Give me a hit on
safer.
that. And give the rationale for that.
Autonomous vehicles are going to be built by companies, are being built by companies. They have every incentive to be super paranoid for, at least in the United States, because of the litigious nature of what we have in this country. So it's not going to make economic sense to field vehicles that are not super safe and super paranoid about whether or not they're going to hit a pedestrian or a bicyclist or even another car, for that matter. So I think it'll make it far safer. There's some sort of game theory work that's been done to suggest that in some cities, because of the prevalence of autonomous cars, pedestrians will become emboldened and will make city centers or portions of cities, certain cities, impassable because pedestrians just walk wherever they want and don't pay any mind to the autonomous car and kind of clog up the streets. I think this is one of those areas that, as those problems develop, we'll figure out solutions. The existing idea of crosswalks and jaywalking laws are all a consequence of the automobile. There was no jaywalking before the automobile. There were no crosswalks. People did just walk wherever they wanted because the worst that was going to happen is a horse is going to hit you, which wouldn't be great. But there weren't that many of them compared to people.
Okay, number 2 here, and we're just taking this down. Will autonomous vehicles reduce greenhouse gases or create more? And I know that you alluded to that a little bit with your talk about climate change, but explain out why you're actually more pessimistic about that than you originally were.
I think, here's the thing, it entirely depends on the adoption of electric vehicles. If we end up down a path, and there's been lots of studies looking at different variations of it, but I think having done all these kinds of studies looking at the impact of climate change, I did this fairly large study called the Gigaton Throwdown back in 2008 and looked at primary and secondary impacts of climate. To actually estimate it is incredibly hard, and I think it really comes down to electric vehicles. Why? Because we could end up in a world where autonomous vehicles get deployed in regular conventional fossil fuel cars, gas and diesel. And if you look at the vehicles out there, most of the autonomous deployments are using gasoline or diesel cars or trucks. So I am, unfortunately, I used to be of the opinion that autonomy and EVs are kind of like made for each other. They had to go together, mostly because of an assumption that the electrical loads for all the autonomous systems were large enough that you needed to have a large power pack. But that's turned out not to be true. The power requirements have plummeted. You can run a regular internal combustion engine and have it work properly. If cities require, and if governments require a continued push to electric vehicles, and we maintain at least a decently clean grid, then I see positive impact from autonomous vehicles, even with all of the sprawl and all of that. But it really comes down to electric vehicles, and so in that way, it maybe doesn't matter what happens with autonomy. If electric vehicles have their own compelling logic, then it'll happen. I will tell you there is one exception to that, which is electric vehicles probably make more sense for a fleet than for an individual, because the longer you operate them, generally speaking, and under today's economics, so I'm qualifying all this because it's not that simple. Under all those statements, electric vehicles make sense. But why am I qualifying it? Because in an autonomous vehicle world, there are going to be a lot of advantages, improvements in the fuel efficiency of regular internal combustion vehicles as well. Reduction in all the collision equipment, not having to accelerate as fast, there's a better, smarter driving. And so you might end up with internal combustion vehicles that are also super efficient on a kind of per mile basis and better suited for fleets. Today's passenger vehicles really are not designed for fleets. The fact that they're in a taxi cab fleet or whatever is just kind of, there's no OEM that says I want to be in a taxi cab fleet. So that's and there's an even longer answer than this, but the real short answer is it depends. Depends on electric vehicles.
Folks, we're going to open the mic up very quickly here, but unintended consequences. We chatted a little bit about that leading up in our thinking about this, and I saw the intriguing, what we left on the cutting room floor was sex, and among other things. Why don't you tell us about, as you've been thinking about this, what are some things that you can imagine, just like the car and the suburbs and the, drive-in movies and drive-in burgers, and I mean, what do you see kind of coming off this in other unintended consequences?
That 4-year-old kid that looks at the world through a kind of, wow, the world's changed, is still in there. And that kind of anthropological view of the world, sex is important. It's fundamental to our survival. And so it flavors the way that we experience things in obvious ways, but also in less obvious ways. So the most obvious thing is, look, cars are sold with sex and sex appeal. You know, there's the testosterone-driven appeal, there's the feminine appeal, and so I think that will change. Like, how will you sell access to a service, I mean, when sex is still like a fundamental driver in our motivations? Now, a lot of that's going to move online, and already is moving online, but I still think that there will be things, and marketers will be clever about doing that. And then the second is just more obvious. I mean, baby boomers figured out that, you know, they can get Randy in the back seat of a car. There's going to be a generation that figures out it's not going to be that hard. It's like pretty logical. Like, you have this autonomous vehicle that's driving itself. Well, what are you going to do? Like,
we'll see. All right. Anyhow. We're going to open up the mic here. And so one of the things we do is we have two mics here. There's a lot of folks, I've looked at this RSVP list, a lot of people from the auto industry, from different companies, from universities, from all kinds of things. So you're a lot smarter than me asking questions. Let's start over here. Do stand up, though, if you can, and just say who you are, some affiliation if you want to, and ask your question or say what you want to say.
Thanks. Good evening. Is this on?
Oop.
not yet.
Is it turned on?
While we're waiting here, I wish I had a better creative answer to your question about how I arrived. It's nothing very exciting.
Go ahead.
But by the way, if you can, like, score me a ride and any of that other stuff.
My name's Henry Chesbrough. I'm a professor over across the bay in Berkeley, maybe a streetcar suburb. Thanks a lot for your talk, and great and provocative thoughts. One of the things I'm wondering about is we're going to have a period where autonomous and whatever the traditional vehicles are called are going to coexist side by side for an extended period. What do we know about the benefits of autonomous when they're surrounded by a bunch of traditional vehicles, sitting out on highways and traffic jams, et cetera? This platooning stuff sounds fantastic when you've got an array of autonomous vehicles, but when you've got that interspersed with a bunch of crazy humans, what do we know about the coexistence of that, and do we lose the benefits until we get to a tipping point, for example?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think there's all kinds of speculation about it that I've read and had myself. I do think that it comes back to fundamentals. Humans are really creative, so they will figure stuff out, like if there's a platooning going on, hey, maybe I can sneak in there somehow and participate. I think that a lot of the benefits, we may end up in a world where the mixture of the two is not great, and we can't take advantage of all the benefits of autonomous vehicles. And I think that's going to lead to a partitioning off of either portions of streets or highways or whatever dedicated to autonomous vehicles. Obviously, it'd be way better if we can integrate together and be able to use the same infrastructure for both. And at least in the beginning, I think that will work, because we're not, I mean, as difficult as it is to build an autonomous vehicle, we're not asking, typically we're not asking them to be able to handle the sort of super complicated situations or the anticipated gamesmanship that a human driver might engage in. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that's a long way.
You say there's someone back there? Grab. And we'll come up here too.
Hello, I'm Keith Miller. I work for a Vibe Consultancy, my own consultancy. It's a brand and strategy agency in San Francisco. So I'm a sports driving enthusiast. And so I always have conflicts of, am I going to lose my sport mode in my autonomous car? And how do the folks that still want to drive blend into the autonomous movement as things move forward, especially with the electric car movement compared to the, gas engine combustion, which you can feel the engine. And it seems like a lot of experience as you're leaving if we move to the automotive or autonomous driving scenario. And it just seems like it's hard to envision that in 10 years.
Yeah, well, Keith, you're still going to be able to drive. Just like if we've been having this conversation about the advent of mechanized farming, I could promise you that you're still going to be able to garden, even if you can't make a living off of farming. So yeah, I mean, driving will be a hobby, like gardening or like making furniture.
Okay, go ahead. But so there'll be a market, there'll be cars being sold there'll still be a Camaro or something you'll grab.
Absolutely. You're gonna, in fact, you might even be able to get way more, since it's likely that eventually that kind of behavior ends up on a track in some sort of like prescribed way. It's likely that you're going to be able to get even more powerful vehicles to be able to kind of get your thrills on a track.
Over here.
Alex Rosenthal. I used to work for Sunil at Sidecar, and now I'm at Lyft. I agree with you completely, particularly on the combination of AV and ridesharing.
Brilliant!
Being the solution for everybody. However, it is a very urban perspective, and I'm wondering, what is your perspective? Obviously, it's going to be very, very different for very long distance car rides, say from San Francisco to LA, and also in rural environments. How do we drive the adoption of AV and or ride sharing in those circumstances?
In more of the suburban areas or rural areas?
In rural areas and all the above, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I do think that as the costs, as the labor component is gone, or actually, by the way, labor will not disappear from the operating cost of an autonomous vehicle. It's simply going to get very, very small, because you're going to have all this some layer of cost associated with managing it, but whatever, that's a minor detail. I think the cost is going to come down so much that it's going to make economic sense, at least in the dense suburbs. It really already makes sense in dense suburbs to take ride sharing for certain trips, but it's going to extend the window to 2 to 3x the distance of what you can do today. I also think that one of the other questions I have, it seems to me that for long distance trips, here to LA, for example, you should be able to, I'd be willing to bet that the door-to-door experience of getting into a platoon for a long distance trip, 4 to 6 hour trip, would beat a high-speed train. I haven't done the math, but it feels like it should for at least most passenger trips. If it's going to go point to point like downtown San Francisco, downtown LA, obviously it's not going to beat it. But that's not most trips.
I actually think someone from Hyperloop is here. Is there a Hyperloop person that could respond to that?
Well, Hyperloop's a whole.
Okay, it's a different.
It's much faster,
yeah,
right? Presumably.
But I do know that's interesting. By the way, if there's folks out there that have strong objections to what his, red ocean bloodbath out there for the auto industry,
Oh, yeah.
whatever. Love to hear that. So you don't always have to ask a question if you actually have some counter to it. It's actually just good for the whole conversation here. We have one here, and then we got one there too, yeah? Could you stand up and introduce yourself?
Christoph Drösser, a journalist from Germany. As I take it from your talk, you see autonomous vehicles not as privately owned cars, but as a service. So the one question would be, won't it be cool to have your own autonomous vehicle?
Yep.
And the other would be, people will use it first as an add-on to the car that they have, but do you see cars getting obsolete? And so to ask you, what year will less than 50% of American families have their own car?
Sorry,
He's
what
not
year
question.
will
What year will less than half of American families have their own car?
will no longer have their own car?
No longer any car.
The inverse of your question.
Yeah, the inverse of the question. That's a great question. It's certainly not going to be 10 years. But it feels like the kind of thing that could happen in 15 and 20 years. I think it can happen shockingly fast. Now that's for your own dedicated car, whether it's autonomous or conventional. I think there will be people who want their own dedicated autonomous car. Why might you want one? Well, maybe it's set up in a particular way that you like. Maybe you want to be able to store your stuff in it. I don't know, maybe you want to have sex in it. Like, a public car is going to have a high level of surveillance, and you're not going to be able to be private in a publicly shared autonomous vehicle in one of these fleets. I think also from a security standpoint, if you're a public official of any high stature, if you are a billionaire, if you're a CEO of a large company, you are not going to want to get into a publicly shared autonomous vehicle. We're already concerned about ransomware of, thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars for some data out of a company, sometimes hundreds of thousands. Imagine if that's your CEO. Like, your actual person is hijacked and taken away. And the more complex a computer system gets, the easier it is to hack it and to figure out ways to manipulate it. So these systems, I know there's a ton of energy going into making them more safe, but there's no way, one of my companies is an email security company, Brightmail. There's no way you can ensure 100% security. And so there's going to be a need for autonomous cars. And by the way, there are going to be some people who will continue to have a driver, right? The President of the United States will never have an autonomous car because it's simply going to be too hazardous to allow someone of that kind of high target, cyber target, to allow them to be completely computer controlled.
Gerald, we got Gerald here and then in the back there. Good.
Hi, Gerald Harrison is like this guy. I run a small consulting firm here in San Francisco, and I used to work at GBN with Pete. And I'm just going to say, Sunil, you're a nice guy. Okay.
Thank you. But you know when they start out with.
You definitely need some scenario planning time. I mean, I just sat here and blew so many holes in your presentation. It wasn't even funny.
Bring it.
The primary one being that people who buy cars do not make them on an economically rational basis. Let me give you an example right now. You cannot buy a Honda Pilot SUV in this area unless you pay the full market price. You can buy a used Toyota Prius for about $9,000. They're sitting on the lot. Nobody's buying them, okay? So just like the Google Glasses needed scenarios, you are in great need of them. Because a lot of your assumptions are just flat out wrong. Your concept about the cost of public transportation, the comparison you did, you cooked your numbers because you didn't include the cost of the passengers sitting in the bus. That wasn't in your numbers, okay? So I'm just telling you, man, get a scenario plan or someone to challenge you because there are massive holes in what you're saying. You're a nice guy, but there are massive holes in what you're saying.
So,
that's
that's great. It's part of why I'm here is to hear challenges, and I can believe that some of what I say sounds fantastic, and unbelievable. I would say, and for sure, people do not make straight ahead rational economic choice, right? We've all read the books and heard the TED Talks about behavioral economics and all that. However, what we know is that price and convenience wins. And
The Honda Prius, man. Cheaper, less fuel.
but it's not. There are other reasons why people buy these other cars, and price and convenience just always wins. And once you've experienced price and convenience, you don't go back. Like, there is, you think about the advances that have happened, like, is there anyone ready to go back to the land of only taxis available in San Francisco? No one. Price and convenience. Is there anyone, I don't know, I'm sure that, and believe me, there were people who argued why taxis should remain the dominant way to get around, kind of an on-demand way in San Francisco. And they had good rational arguments for it. I just think price and convenience will win. Yeah, but thank you for challenging and asking the question.
Well, let's hear other ideas. Go ahead.
Hi, Sunil.
Hi.
Hi. I'm Heather Somerville, and I work for Reuters. Sunil, I wanted to go back to your...
You're right.
The AV guy knows it's a tough question, so I paid him off earlier.
I wanted to go back to your elasticity curve slide that you showed and ask you if...
No, I'm just trying to get him to pump it up.
I was kidding about paying him off.
Do Uber and Lyft's current business model allow them to become sustainable, profitable businesses? Or will the actions they have to take to achieve that result in so much increase in cost and convenience that their network effects will deteriorate as well as their scale as a result?
Great question. I think the short answer is yes, those companies can be sustainable. A lot of what's going on right now is similar to what happened with Amazon and other companies that need to get to a particular scale. And Amazon and others basically built a business strategy and a set of investors, including public investors, that basically said, yes, we get it. At some point, you're going to be profitable, and we're willing to subsidize that rise to the tune of billions of dollars. And I think the same thing is true of these ride-sharing networks. If, the big thing that makes them unprofitable right now is the cost of marketing, driver acquisition, customer acquisition, or rider acquisition. And if that was turned off, then certainly on a gross basis and maybe on a net basis, they can be profitable.
I'm going to take a question as a prerogative here, but let's see the hands up there. I just want to let's get to hear this woman here. And let's get someone in the back there. Yeah, this woman here in the back, right there, in the purple, yeah. But I just want to ask a question as we're waiting for that briefly here. We haven't touched the regulation piece. And with Reinvent, as a media company, we get to interview all these awesome folks. But I had a really interesting interview with Robin Chase, who is one of the co-founders of Zipcar. And she's done a lot of work on this autonomous vehicle space too. And she's kind of talked about a heaven or hell scenario, kind of based on there could go a lot of different ways here.
Yeah. I like her acronym, the RATS, the Retail Autonomous.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. One of the things that I had never thought about until this interview with her was to say that given that you have an autonomous vehicle, you want it to keep moving all the time, you wouldn't want to park it, that from a retail perspective, nothing would stop someone from filling it with toilet paper or something, and just when you want to get if you want to get something immediately, boom, and our streets would get clogged. Yeah. With just these crazy, instead of coming from warehouses on the edges of the city, we just have them in our streets all the time. So I'm just wondering, but this is actually a regulatory thing. As these things come up, do you see the need for strong kind of regulation at some level? Let's say kind of ban that or something, or do you feel it's, what's the role of essentially a city or community saying this is how we want our streets to be run, or this is where we draw the line, or here's what we're going to tolerate, or whatever? I'm just curious.
I listened to Robin's talk, and
you did?
Super interesting. Part of the fun of this category and this topic is you get to imagine all kinds of scenarios, and you get to imagine all kinds of nightmare scenarios. My perspective on regulation goes back to the fundamentals of what is this technology about? Well, one of them is about the driver. The other one is about safety. Like, these vehicles will be incredibly safe. 35,000 people in the United States die every year from auto accidents. I think it's around 1 million people that are injured, and over 1 million people a year that die around the world from automobile accidents. The leading cause of death for young adults. Leading cause. So if you are a regulator or a lawmaker concerned with safety and the well-being of your population, what should be your attitude to autonomous vehicles? Should it be, we don't quite know about that, there's this nightmare scenario that might happen, and we need to make sure we take care of all the contingencies, and I don't want to get fired because, you know, one death happened. To me, this is like you're in charge of drug approval. Someone's found a lung cancer drug that's 50% successful on 100% terminal patients, and you're saying, oh, yeah, I don't know, can we get it to 99%? Like, literally, there are people dying that could not die if we adopt autonomous vehicles. So it's the fundamental nature of this technology. Regulators should be figuring out ways to accelerate the adoption as much as possible. I think there have been certain steps that, I think are mistakes. Talk of trying to anticipate all these problems now before they actually happen, I think is a mistake. And I think that I'm not sure that the California regulations were the right thing.
Too restrictive.
Yeah, I mean, they're not very restrictive, to be honest. They cost $150 and you have to provide data back. But like, what exactly was the harm that they were designed to stop? Not to prevent, but to stop. And it's not clear to me. One person has died.
Hear you. Okay, woman here, yeah?
Hi, okay, so my name is Sarah, and I'm a user.
And by the way, the regulations don't prevent any of that. That was a Tesla. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
No problem. So my name is Sarah. I'm a user experience strategist. I'm a designer. I'm really interested in scenarios and specifically social interaction. So right now we have high-profile media cases around Uber drivers and Uber users being involved in issues of safety. And so I'm curious kind of what your thoughts are around the social environment of these cars in the future, specifically around safety, and what that will be like for the users who are interacting with one another, who are interacting with a robot. What are the social environments going to be like, and how are companies right now planning for that?
Yeah, Sarah, that's a great question. I mean, safety is top of mind concern, and I think whenever we encounter a new technology, especially one where like our bodies are involved in some way, safety is appropriately the top concern. I think so what we talked about so far with safety is mostly about pedestrians and bicyclists and all that. I think the safety for people who are participating like inside the vehicle, they're going to be pretty safe from accidents like that might happen in today's ride sharing or taxi or regular driven car. But it seems to me pretty inevitable that there's monitoring equipment inside the vehicle. Now, maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe there's enough other methods to kind of score the risk of vandalism and other kinds of harms to other people Perhaps there's some kind of rating system or something like that that could avoid that high level of scrutiny. But it seems to me it's so cheap to put a camera in and multiple cameras in that that is kind of an inevitable part of what ends up in the shared autonomous fleets. And then I think there's going to be a tremendous public awareness and engagement exercise to sort of demonstrate that they really are safe.
You got a woman back here too? Let's see all the hands there. Is there someone in the way back? There's a woman there. You would just stand up.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Sloan from Capgemini in the UK. You talked about supply and demand and the big players that are involved in the supply and demand, such as Google, etc. In the UK, Amazon has just announced an affiliation with Whole Foods that rocketed the stock market for the Tesco and the other retailers. And they've also announced that they're likely to enter the market for car sales. How do you think Amazon will respond to this particular opportunity?
They already are involved in on-demand delivery. The way they do it today is through contracted networks of delivery people in different geographies. Swapping out those delivery people with autonomous delivery certainly has to be on their roadmap. I think a more interesting question is, would they also want to do people delivery? At Sidecar, we pioneered, we were the first to combine people and packages in the same car. And we know that makes economic sense. In other words, you can imagine, just like in an airplane, down in the cargo hold, they might be carrying whatever, mail or packages or whatever. In the same way, you could imagine the same thing for delivery. So if Amazon already has a big network of vehicles out there doing delivery, for them to add people delivery to it would be pretty straightforward. On the demand side, they don't have a lot of people asking where they want to go, although, I don't know, they're getting into restaurant delivery and others. Maybe there's a window into people through that way. I think the challenge for them would be on the demand side. Like, where do they get the demand for people wanting to go from A to B?
We got a person here. How about the guy in the check shirt back there? Good.
Hi, I'm Phil. So my question is about the slide you had related to the red ocean supply and demand. So I think you had Google, Apple, Uber, and regional ride sharing kind of predicated on the idea that a maps service is currently very expensive to provide, and there are going to be a limited number of players. So my question is, how that might change when the act of mapping becomes a lot cheaper. If you're, say, Tesla, and you have a bunch of vehicles roaming about equipped with sensors, that constructing a Maps API could become a lot cheaper. And if you have an open table reservation, you would connect to the Tesla Maps API. And so how that assumption around the constriction of maps could be wrong. And interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. There's certainly a lot of activity in the map world. In order to have demand for people going from A to B, you have to have not just the underlying data around the maps, but people coming to it, lots of consumers coming to it to actually ask that question. So I don't see how, like the former Nokia unit or any of those, are going to end up with significant eyeballs, because Apple and Google don't just have maps. They have operating systems on the dominant mobile phones, which are the devices that you're naturally going to go to A to B. There are other potential players, companies like transit companies. I always thought Yelp had an opportunity, but they're simply going to get swamped by the huge volume of demand that is possible out of those other platforms.
Okay, we got a bunch of here. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Matt Desmond. I'm also with Capgemini. I'm from Detroit, the world of old automotive. So my question to you, a very learned man, is how we can think about a future of autonomous vehicles without a solution for preventing cyber attacks without talking about required firmware over-the-air updates. I can't imagine I would ever get into an autonomous vehicle unless I knew it had a way to be updated and patched if needed. I'm kind of likening it to the days in the late 80s, early 90s when I was scrambling around patching PCs before there were enterprise solutions for antivirus. What are your thoughts on this for safety?
Yeah, I think it's a super important concern. Are you asking the question, do I think cars can or should be deployed without that kind of protection?
Yeah, how can you be such a strident advocate of rapid adoption of autonomous vehicles really transforming our lives when you're essentially potentially advocating driving around in a Windows PC with Windows 95 with no antivirus? And we're not talking about that. There's this Sidecar Act that just got introduced, which really doesn't mention autonomous, but it does talk about, it's like the first inklings of regulation for connectivity. I'm just trying to be practical. I would not want to get into a vehicle that couldn't be patched remotely. I know some manufacturers like Tesla can do it, but that didn't come up in your talk. Like, there's got to be a way, there's got to be a consortium, there's got to be an open source way to do it. That's kind of what I'm getting at.
Well, I'm certainly concerned about this world. Obviously, you know, it sounds like you know a lot about it. My observation, however, is that consumers have shown a track record of being willing to trade off a vague threat in the future against price and convenience today. And we see that with privacy and advertising. I mean, you know, who pays for all of their content that they look at on the internet? Not a lot of people. And you're giving up a ton of vague, I mean, those of us who pay a lot of attention know that it's not so vague and it gets very concrete very quickly. And it'll get more concrete in the future. The threat will be bigger in the future because of, you know, data being collected today. And I think a similar kind of thing with cybersecurity. But the reality is, and the track record is that, you know, we'll kind of like regulation, we see the problems and we fix it rather than kind of anticipating every possible. We obviously want to fix the obvious holes and keep that from happening, but I don't see a need to wait until every single thing is fixed before we deploy.
I hate to say it, but Ralph Nader, unsafe at any speed, to get the auto industry to add seatbelts to cars, took people dying. That's why I mentioned it.
Yeah. So just so that the video can hear it, your point is that it took people dying for Ralph Nader to get traction on regulation. That's absolutely right. I think my counterpoint would be 35,000 people die a year, and how many people will die because a car is hijacked and, you know, driven into something? It will be horrible when it happens, but there are 35,000 people dying a year now.
But by the way, part of the
Oh,
idea...
and sorry, can I just add to that? Ralph Nader, I'm a big fan. He got fought so hard because, and one of the big concerns that like airbags are going to kill kids. Unfortunately, they do sometimes. You know, seatbelts are going to harm people, they're going to decapitate people. They do sometimes. Like these, there are problems with the new safety enhancements. There are problems with this safety enhancement, and we're going to deal with them over time.
And just one thing I just want to say, part of the gathering of folks here is we got about 10 minutes here of just finishing up this formal part, but the idea is stay here. There's a half hour. We want you guys to discuss these issues. It's not the only guy who has the great idea here.
Lots of smart people.
There's a lot of smart people here. And honestly, these are really fascinating and open-ended questions, and it's stuff that we're all wrestling with. Go ahead. I think we have a guy here. We're going to get as many as we can in here.
Hello, my name is Jean-Baptiste Rouget. I'm from Capgemini in France. On Sunday, I took Uber to move around in San Francisco, and we had a very nice lady driver who was doing that as a second job and told us a lot about San Francisco, and we spent 10 minutes where we learned a lot. And it seems that your assumption is that the benefit, that the autonomous car will be a human-to-machine interaction, and that the relationship element of a number of the services we get is totally out of date. And how do you see a world where a relationship doesn't have more importance than just automation?
I love starting and running Sidecar. One of the great joys was meeting drivers, learning about their stories. It's one of the most wonderful things about ride sharing. And I'm sure you've experienced, like you're talking about, like you get to meet interesting people you just normally not going to run into. Yeah, it's one of the great joys. I go back to price and convenience. Automatic teller machines replaced a lot of face-to-face interaction, but they were open 24 hours a day. They eventually were at every corner, super convenient. At first, they were very cheap. They used to be free, but then fees came along later. But my point being, you know, in that case, almost all about convenience, not so much about price. And people gave up a lot of personal interaction in exchange. I mourn that personal interaction. I think it's one of the fundamental problems that we've got with society. We don't have enough social interaction. Thank you for showing up today. No offense to the people streaming. But like seriously, showing up and interacting, like that's the stuff of humanity, and we're going to need to find other venues for it.
Or people might pay a premium for that. I mean, that might be...
Yeah, that's a great point.
That'll be some little subset of folks who might do that. Or not, who knows? We have a guy here, and then we'll go here.
Hi, my name is Rakesh. And I work in the energy space. Thanks for your talk. So my question was related to using these autonomous vehicles as distributed energy resources. As they are sitting idle, you know, to address the spiky demand situation and capital use and things like that, they could, what are your thoughts on them providing or being an essential part of the electric grid?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's part of the original, or not original, it's a vision that we've had for a long time of how could we integrate electric vehicles into the grid. I think the short answer really is I don't know. I think it's something that I've thought about, but I haven't done the math on would an electric vehicle that's also an autonomous vehicle, you know, does it pay for itself connected to the grid versus being out giving a ride? Does that kind of pay for the capital cost? Because you're not just paying for the batteries at that point. You got to pay for the whole car, even though you're only getting benefit from the batteries and the electronics. I don't know. Interesting question to figure out. It's true. He's saying most of the grid is not two-way. There's massive enhancements that are required to make that work. But it is. I do think that. I mean, will that world end up happening? Possibly. Stationary battery is a big competition, and yeah.
We're good. Okay, a couple last questions here, and go ahead. Here.
Okay. Hi, I'm Barney Pell. I'm an entrepreneur and angel investor and friend of Sunil. So I actually had two questions I'll try to get in. You can answer, I guess, either one. First, we talked about the economics of ride sharing and self-driving vehicles, how they interact. It seems to me like one of the big assets that the big ride-sharing companies like Uber and Lyft have is they've got a two-sided marketplace. It takes a lot of money to get those drivers, more consumers, more passengers, and so on. Now with self-driving vehicles, you don't need one whole side of the marketplace. Okay, if you can afford to buy the cars, you're a big automaker or something and have a fleet, then you can walk in, and I don't know what Uber's advantage is because they don't have the driver advantage. If you just bring a fleet, they all drive. Now, you know, customers will pay they'll download whatever app they need to for price and convenience. So what's the real long-term value of like Uber and Lyft in a world where these automakers or anybody else can come in and just create a fleet?
It's a good question. I think that's a common question and a common vision for autonomous vehicle makers. The value they have is simply that it's a two-sided market, and you need to have both sides. And if you've built up a base of 8 million riders that are opening up your app on a regular basis, you cannot recreate that overnight or even in a year. You need years and years and lots of marketing dollars to be able to build up that same advantage on the demand side. So, you know, as I kind of walked through in the presentation, let's imagine that suddenly someone out of nowhere has a fully autonomous level 5 vehicle today, and they have hundreds of thousands of them. They deploy them in some few cities. They still have to build demand for it, and yes, they will be able to deploy at a very low price and kind of high level of efficiency, but first of all, with billions of dollars in the bank, Uber could subsidize the human capital to maintain their advantage for some time until a competitor catches up. But let's say, forget about even that for a second. It will take a long time. So let's say it's 2 years later, or a year later, 2 years later, and there's a equally comparable autonomous vehicle from competitor A. Uber or Google or whoever else can plug that into their demand network. So maybe it's fallen, maybe it's no longer, you know, kind of 8 million to 1, maybe it's, you know, 8 million to 2 million, but it's not going to be 8 million to 8 million. Like, you will not, like, trust me, it's hard. It's hard to build that demand side. And yeah, it takes time and energy and money, and there's not an adequate differentiation on the part of AV makers to be able to build that big flywheel of demand. And so they're going to have to think about it differently. And then there's this whole fleet problem of capital utilization of the fleet. I think there may be solutions to that. One could be having a mix of privately owned vehicles and vehicles that are available to a pool, able to give rides. So think of it more like timeshare or owning a vacation property where sometimes you're using it, sometimes you're making it available to the pool, to the marketplace. And during times of high demand, Friday at 2 a.m., you're at home asleep, you don't care if your autonomous car gives a ride, although you might want to make sure it's well protected. So I see that as a future model that can work, but to date, I have not seen companies really thinking about that and really aggressively going after it. They seem to think, oh, I'm going to launch a fleet, and I'm going to get a bunch of demand, and end of story. It won't be that way.
We're going in the back there.
Hey, Raphael Hostetler. I'm running Roboy and Lucy in an IA and ethics initiative. And I was wondering, you were advocating for policymakers to accelerate the whole process in order to not have 37,000 people dead at the same time. I'm wondering, AVs will put like 10+ million people out of jobs. So how do you gauge the two things relative to each other?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think with new technology, there is always a concern about employment. And those concerns are, I get it. I get the concern. And lots of very smart people say that there's going to be, you know, a robo-apocalypse where automation is just going to wipe out a bunch of jobs, and top of the list is drivers, because driver turns out to be the #1 job for males in the United States. And I think it's something around 30 of the states, it's the top job of any. So it employs a lot of people. Uber alone has like 1 million drivers. So yeah, it's a big deal. And for sure, there's going to be displacement in the short term, especially if we see this rapid adoption. There's going to be a lot of drivers that no longer are driving. However, I don't see that turning into a robo job apocalypse. Maybe that's better. I don't know. Robo-apocalypse. I like a robo-apocalypse. I don't see a robo-apocalypse because, well, let's take some examples. Automatic teller machines. We talked about them earlier. Compared to the 1980s, how many people think there are fewer tellers than there were? Show of hands. Fewer. How many think they're the same? How many think there are more tellers? Oh, wow, it's all evenly split. Okay, well, how many just don't care about this question? Well, it turns out it's about the same. So we had this, sorry? Okay, let me give you another example. Since the Great Recession began, the comment was, on a per capita basis, it doesn't quite match. And Fair point, but the answer is not that it fell off a cliff. We opened up more branches, society, opened up more branches, ended up with more jobs for tellers, doing higher grade work. No longer, I'd like $100, somewhat more complex transactions. Another example, since the Great Recession began, you've all heard the stories of retail jobs falling off a cliff, tons of layoffs, but of course, e-commerce is the big reason for it. Now, since you know who's speaking and you know my opinion about this, you may already guess, but how many think there are fewer jobs that the balance is fewer jobs in e-commerce and there's more layoffs than there have been e-commerce jobs created? Anybody?
No, fewer jobs in retail, you mean?
Right, in other words, that we've laid off more jobs than we've created in e-commerce.
Yeah.
Anybody? No, everyone's afraid to make that. Okay, who thinks it's about the same? Okay, who thinks that it's way worse that we've created more jobs in e-commerce than we've laid off in retail? Okay, a majority in that category. Okay, but do you know how much?
What's the answer?
It's 7 times as many jobs. There have been 50,000 jobs lost, 350,000 jobs created in e-commerce.
What salary?
At a better salary on average than retail. There are jobs in warehouses, there are jobs in IT centers, they're all up and down the supply chain. 7 times more jobs. Automation is going to result in a huge wave of job growth, but they won't be in drivers.
Well, that is a good place. Even though there's a ton of questions, we actually have a good half hour here. The bar's open. There's more food. He's going to be hanging out here. You can come up and talk. But talk amongst yourselves. But do stay here and hang out. And let's give a final, really great applause for Sunil Paul. Stimulated evening. But grab a drink and stay here. And you can ask your question. I'm sorry you have.